The office lights flickered off, one by one. Only the janitor remained. The CEO watched from behind the cold glass wall. He moved quietly, methodical, invisible. She frowned slightly. Something about him felt different. When he clocked out, she made a sudden decision. She followed him, not as a CEO, but as a shadow. What she saw that night, she wasn't prepared for. A secret she never imagined. It was a truth that would shatter her world and change his life forever. The headquarters of Grant Industries was a monument to glass and steel, a towering monolith that dominated the city skyline. At 38, Isabella Grant ruled this empire with a cold, disciplined precision that earned her the nickname the Iron Queen in the business journals. She believed in efficiency. She believed in metrics. To her, the thousands of people moving through her buildings were either assets to be optimized or obstacles to be removed. She lived her life by a rigid schedule, rarely looking down from her ivory tower on the 50th floor, where the air was thin and the problems were always expressed in percentages. Isabella's life was a series of high-stakes meetings and silent corridors. She had sacrificed everything for the company, her social life, her sleep, and any semblance of emotional vulnerability. She prided herself on seeing what others missed, a decimal point out of place in a 1,000-page report or a slight hesitation in a rival's voice. But she was about to realize she had missed the most important thing of all. Then there was Daniel Morey. Daniel was 46 years old, a man whose presence was defined by his absence of noise. To the rest of the world, he was just the night janitor. He wore a faded blue uniform that had seen better days and pushed a heavy, rattling cart filled with industrial chemicals and gray rags. He moved through the halls like a ghost, cleaning the residue of high-stakes corporate wars, the spilled coffee of exhausted interns and the crumpled notes of frustrated executives. He was a single father to a 13-year-old boy named Kai, though no one at the office knew that. They didn't even know his last name. To them, he was simply the help, a figure that existed only in the periphery of their vision. Daniel worked with a quiet, almost meditative intensity. He was always on time. He never complained about the late hours or the messy spills. While the high-paid executives barked into their encrypted phones and slammed mahogany doors in fits of ego, Daniel simply buffed the floors until they shone like mirrors, reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Most employees walked past him without a glance, treating him like a piece of the office furniture, an automated part of the building's maintenance cycle. Isabella noticed him, but not for his hard work. She noticed him because of her obsession with security and control. Night after night, while she sat in her darkened office reviewing the daily logistics, she saw him on the security feeds. He was staying late, unusually late. Long after his shift was technically over, the cameras showed him still in the building. He wasn't just mopping, he was rearranging chairs in the conference rooms with agonizing care, ensuring they were perfectly aligned with the table edges. He was straightening the frame photos of the company's founders, wiping away fingerprints that only he seemed to see. He was even organizing the magazines in the lobby into neat, chronological stacks. Is he fishing for a promotion? Isabella wondered, her eyes narrowing as she watched the grainy monitor. Or is he looking for something he shouldn't be? In her world, no one did extra work for free. There was always a motive, an angle, a hidden agenda. She assumed he wanted leverage, perhaps a way to ask for a raise by showing initiative, or maybe he was a corporate spy planted by a competitor to gather discarded documents. She had built her success on suspicion, and she wasn't about to stop now. One rainy Tuesday evening, Isabella stayed late herself to finish a merger proposal. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound being the hum of the air conditioning. From her darkened office, she watched Daniel through the glass wall. He paused in the hallway, standing in front of the family wall, a large display featuring photos of employees and their children at various company outings, a PR move Isabella had approved but never truly looked at. Daniel didn't clean the wall. He just stood there, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. He reached out and touched the frame over a photo of a young boy at a company picnic. His hand lingered for a moment, his fingers tracing the outline of the child's smile. Then he pulled back, his shoulders slumped with a weight of profound sorrow that Isabella couldn't identify. He looked like a man carrying the world on his back, yet he didn't buckle. Curiosity finally outweighed her caution. She needed to know what this man was hiding. When Daniel finally clocked out and vanished into the cold, biting rain, Isabella didn't call her driver. She grabbed her designer coat, kept her sunglasses on despite the dark, and stepped into the elevator. Human mark. Isabella expected to confirm a suspicion of greed or betrayal. Instead, she prepared to confront something she didn't understand. A man who worked in the dark for a light she hadn't seen yet. The rain turned into a heavy, rhythmic drizzle as Daniel walked toward the bus stop, his head bowed against the wind. Isabella followed at a safe distance in her unassuming black sedan, her heart beating with an uncharacteristic nervousness. She watched him board the city bus, a vehicle she hadn't stepped foot on since her university days. He sat near the back, staring out the window at the blurred neon lights of the city. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face etched deeper by the harsh interior lighting, yet there was a strange, unbreakable peace in his posture. Isabella followed the bus for nearly 40 minutes, watching as the landscape changed. The glittering skyscrapers and high-end boutiques of the financial district gave way to the worn-down edges of the industrial district. This was a side of the city her performance metrics usually ignored. Rows of boarded-up warehouses and flickering streetlights. Daniel exited the bus near a crumbling community center. The red brick was stained with years of soot, and the sign above the door was missing several letters, flickering weakly in the damp air. Isabella parked her car down the street and waited. She felt like a trespasser in a world she didn't belong to. She climbed out of the car and walked toward the center, watching through the large fogged-up windows that faced the street. Daniel entered a small, brightly lit classroom. The transition was startling. He went into a small side room and emerged minutes later, having shed his janitor's uniform for a simple, clean navy sweater. He looked 10 years younger. He looked like a professional. Suddenly, a group of about 10 children, ranging from ages 10 to 15, rushed toward him. They weren't just greeting a teacher, they were welcoming a hero. Among them was Kai. The boy had bright, intelligent eyes and a smile that lit up the room. He sat in the front row, his notebook already open, his eyes fixed on his father with a mix of love and intense respect. Daniel stepped to a whiteboard that was covered in faded markings. He didn't pick up a mop, he picked up a marker. Isabella watched, breathless and stunned, as the janitor began to teach. He wasn't teaching them how to clean or organize. He was teaching them the basics of advanced calculus and robotics. He spoke with a calm, magnetic authority that Isabella had rarely seen in her own boardroom. He took complex theories, concepts that Isabella knew her own developers struggled with, and broke them down into stories and analogies that the children could grasp. Think of the algorithm like a river, he told them, his voice muffled but clear through the glass. It always finds the path of least resistance, but it needs a bank to guide it. You are the ones building the banks. He wasn't being paid. Isabella could tell by the humble environment and the way the other volunteers, mostly older neighborhood residents, interacted with him. This was a labor of love, a gift given to a community that had been forgotten by people like her. As the hour passed, Isabella saw a man she had never glimpsed in the sterile hallways of Grant Industries. She saw a mentor who didn't raise his voice to get attention. She saw a gentle father who, during a break, walked over to Kai and whispered something in his ear that made the boy laugh out loud. She saw a man who had more wealth in that dilapidated room than she had in her multi-billion-dollar bank accounts. Isabella saw him help a young girl who was struggling with a circuit board. He didn't do it for her. He guided her hands, his patience infinite. When the small LED light on the board finally flickered to life, the girl's face erupted in joy. Daniel didn't take the credit. He just nodded and smiled, as if he knew all along she could do it. After the class ended, the children lingered, reluctant to leave. Daniel and Kai stayed behind to pack up the kits, carefully placing the components back into worn plastic bins. They were laughing quietly, sharing a joke about a faulty sensor. Isabella watched them through the rain-streaked glass, her hand resting on the cold brick of the building. She thought about her office. She thought about the thousands of times she had walked past Daniel while he was on his knees, scrubbing the floor near her desk, his presence ignored as if he were invisible. She realized that in her singular quest for efficiency, she had become blind to the human brilliance and the profound sacrifice standing right in front of her. She had been judging a book not just by its cover, but by the dust on its jacket. The weight of her own arrogance hit her like a physical blow. She realized she knew everything about her company's profit margins, but she knew nothing about the people who made those profits possible. She had built an empire of glass, but she had forgotten how to look through it. Human Mark, Isabella realized she had spent years analyzing spreadsheets and predicting market trends. Yet she had never once asked the name of the man who cleaned the very glass she used to look down on the world. She had been the one who was truly blind. The next morning, the atmosphere in the executive suite was suffocating. Isabella sat behind her massive mahogany desk, the surveillance footage from the previous night still playing on a loop in her mind. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night looking at Daniel's employee file, a thin, unremarkable folder that listed him only as Maintenance Level 1. She buzzed her assistant with a sharp, trembling finger. "Send Daniel Morey to my office. Immediately. Cancel my 9 a.m." When Daniel walked in, he looked out of place in the high-ceiling room. His janitor's uniform was freshly pressed, but it contrasted sharply with the Italian leather chairs and the original artwork on the walls. He appeared confused, perhaps even a bit worried that he was about to be fired, but he remained composed. He didn't fidget. He didn't look at the floor. He looked Isabella straight in the eye with a quiet, unshakable dignity that made her feel small. "You stayed late again last night, Daniel," Isabella began. Her voice, usually a cold blade, was now soft and uncertain. "I apologize if my presence disturbed you, ma'am," Daniel replied, his voice a steady baritone. "I just like to ensure the office is perfect for the morning. I know how much pressure you and the staff are under. A clean space helps the mind stay clear. It's the least I can do." Isabella leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "I followed you last night, Daniel, to the community center in the East District." Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't get angry or defensive. A small, quiet surprise registered on his face, followed by a faint shadow of concern for his privacy, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I hope I didn't cause any security concerns, Miss Grant." "Security?" Isabella breathed, shaking her head. "Daniel, I watched you teach robotics. I watched you explain mathematics that some of my senior engineers with PhDs struggle to simplify. I watched those kids look at you like you were the most important person in the world. Who are you?" "Really?" Daniel took a slow, deep breath and looked out the window at the city he helped keep clean. 10 years ago, I wasn't pushing a cart, Ms. Grant. I was a lead systems engineer for a major firm in Chicago. I had the house, the car, the metrics you value so much. I loved the work. But then, my wife Elena passed away. It was sudden, an accident." His voice didn't waver, but the pain was evident in the way he gripped the strap of his tool belt. "Kai was only 3. He didn't understand where she went. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking. He was fading away right in front of me." He looked back at Isabella, his eyes piercing. "I realized I couldn't be a lead engineer and the father Kai needed at the same time. The corporate world is a hungry ghost, Isabella. It demanded 60, 70 hours a week. It demanded travel. It demanded that I be on even when my heart was broken. I couldn't give my son the leftovers of my life. So I walked away," he continued. "I chose the night shift as a janitor because it meant I could be there when Kai woke up. I could walk him to school every single morning. I could be there for his soccer games. I could teach him and his friends at night because I had the energy left to do it. I chose stability and presence over a title and a paycheck. I chose my son." Isabella felt a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. She had spent her life running away from the very thing Daniel had run toward: human connection. "Why didn't you ever mention your qualifications? You could have had a high-paying job here, even with flexible hours." Daniel smiled faintly, a sad, knowing expression. "I've worked in buildings like this long enough to know that flexible usually means always available. And I didn't want charity, Ms. Grant. I wanted to earn my way without being part of the machine that eats people's lives. I wanted a job that allowed me to leave the work at the door so I could be 100% present for Kai." Isabella felt her entire worldview crumbling. The cold, mechanical part of her heart was melting under the heat of his integrity. Daniel, I want to offer you a position, and before you say no, listen. I'm creating a new role, technical training and community development supervisor. You would oversee the training of our junior developers, teaching them the why and not just the how, and you would coordinate a new company-wide program to fund and staff community centers like the one you work at. Daniel hesitated. Ms. Grant, my schedule, Kai is my priority, always. I know, Isabella interrupted, her voice firm. The hours are built around the school day. You work when he's in school. You're home when he's home. You won't be a resource. You'll be a human being. And Grant Industries will fully fund the robotics program at your center, including new equipment and a college scholarship fund for those kids. The news of the promotion hit the company like a tidal wave. The board of directors was outraged. They called an emergency meeting. He's a janitor, one elderly board member shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Think of the optics. Our shareholders expect pedigree, not maintenance staff. Isabella stood at the head of the boardroom table, looking at the men and women who shared her old perspective. Her voice rang with a new, unshakable authority. The optics are that we have been blind. We have been ignoring the greatest talent in this building because we were too busy looking at the color of his collar. Daniel Mori has more engineering brilliance in his little finger than a half of our consultants. From now on, this company values the person, the character, and the sacrifice. If you don't like it, you can leave your keys on the way out. Symbol rejected. Status without humanity is just a hollow shell. Isabella realized that a title is what you do, but character is who you are. She chose to lead with her heart for the first time in her life. Daniel transitioned into his new role with the same quiet, unassuming grace he had used to buff the floors. He didn't buy a fleet of designer suits. He showed up in the simple sweaters and comfortable slacks. His presence in the training rooms changed the entire energy of the office. He didn't bark orders or demand deliverables. He asked his students questions. He listened more than he spoke. He mentored the struggling interns with a patience that turned them into the company's rising stars. The junior engineers who used to walk past the janitor without a single word of greeting now lined up at his door to hear his insights on the system architecture and, more importantly, on life. They learned about his volunteer work, and slowly the toxic culture of every man for himself began to evaporate. Respect grew organically, not because of his title, but because of his genuine kindness and the way he made everyone feel seen. Isabella herself changed the most. She started leaving the office at 5 p.m. She started visiting the break rooms, not to check on productivity, but to talk to the people. She realized that the assets she used to manage were actually parents, dreamers, and survivors. One Friday evening, Isabella visited the community center again. This time, she didn't hide in her car. She walked inside, the smell of old wood and floor wax hitting her, a smell she now associated with Daniel's dignity. She sat in the back of the classroom, watching Daniel show a group of teenagers how to wire a basic sensor for a mini rover. Kai noticed her immediately. During a break, he walked over, his hands stained with grease and ink. "Are you Dad's boss?" he asked, his voice curious but filled with the same steady confidence as his father. Isabella looked at the boy and smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. "I suppose I am, Kai. But truth be told, he's teaching me a lot more than I'm teaching him." Kai looked at his father, who was laughing with a student across the room. "He works really hard," the boy said softly, a note of deep pride in his voice. "He always told me that even when life is messy, you have to keep cleaning until you find the beauty underneath. He worked those night shifts for years just so I didn't ever have to feel alone after Mom died. He's my hero." Isabella felt a tear prick her eye, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself in decades. She realized that for years, she had been successful by every market standard, but she had been incredibly, profoundly lonely. Looking at the community around Daniel, she finally saw what real success looked like. It wasn't the glass office or the city view. It was the quiet, unbreakable bond between people who refused to let the world make them cold. Months passed, and the transformation of Grant Industries was complete. The company wasn't just more profitable, it was more alive. There were mentorship programs, family support initiatives, and a genuine sense of shared purpose. The family wall that Daniel used to touch in the dark was no longer a PR stunt. It was a place where employees actually gathered to share stories and support. Daniel continued to teach at the center every single night by choice. He had the money now to buy the most expensive equipment for the kids, but he still made them build things from scratch first. He wanted them to understand the soul of the machine, not just the cost of it. One evening, Isabella walked past the old janitor's closet on the 50th floor. She paused for a moment. The rattling cart was gone, replaced by a modern, silent cleaning system for the new crew, who were now paid a living wage with full benefits. She remembered the man who used to emerge from that door in the shadows, carrying the weight of his grief and his love in silence. She leaned against the doorframe and smiled faintly, then kept walking toward her office, no longer feeling like a queen, but like a part of a family. Final scene. The camera moves away from the skyscraper and into a small, warm kitchen in a modest neighborhood. Daniel and Kai are sitting at the wooden table, which is cluttered with wires, microchips, and a small, half-assembled robot. The room is filled with the comforting smell of home-cooked pasta and the sound of a radio playing softly in the background. Daniel helps Kai steady a soldering iron, his large hand guiding the boy's smaller one with perfect gentleness. There is no stress, no corporate metrics, no shadows of the past. Just a father and a son, building a future together, one connection at a time. Final message. Sometimes, the people we overlook every day, the ones who move in the shadows and clean up the messes we leave behind, are the ones holding the strongest foundations of our world. Don't just look at the uniform. Don't just look at the job. Look at the soul, because the most brilliant lights are often hidden in the quietest places. If you believe healing stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to CPH Healing Stories. We tell the stories of the invisible heroes among us, the ones that should never be forgotten, because sometimes the light you're looking for is right there in the shadow, waiting for you to notice.